Hey, welcome to Cloud and Stack. In this video, I want to talk about what has happened in the cybersecurity space in the last month that you should know as a cybersecurity leader in your organization, in your team, or in your field. These are top of mind topics that organizations should be looking out for if you are in the industry. So let's dive in. I want to start off by talking about the source material, but where you can find all the information that I'm sharing in here. So everything is in here is in my blog post, which you'll find in the description, the link in the description. So I come up with these monthly reports with all these different news and articles that are relevant for people, processes, and technologies that CISOs particularly should be looking out for. So this is a quick glimpse at that page, and I will share this in the description of this video for you to have all access to everything that I'm sharing here today. Let's kick off then by going through the first piece of news from this month, which to me was very highlighting and very important from the Electronic Privacy Information Center organization. It's the epic.org organization, in which they list out and they publish essentially the state AI laws in 2023. That is very important for US organizations or any organizations dealing with US that have to abide to their laws, state laws, especially when they're doing AI, right? And as we know, and if you are working with cybersecurity these days, and for the past few months, you know that AI is top of mind for all organizations. So where does the US state laws are residing currently for AI laws in 2020? Has a very thorough description of all of different laws that somehow they pertain to technology, but also pertain to AI as well. So they come up with different sections. For example, they start off by talking to us about the laws going into effect in 2023. And then they get into the laws passed this legislative session in the US. All right, so there are a number of laws in here, which I will leave the link for reference as well, many of which are very specific to specific parts of the US. But what I find is particularly interesting is this last section called Laws Proposed in this legislative session in the US. At this point, they start listing out different regulations based on different domains of the civil spectrum. Right, so we're thinking here of AI regulations, part of the comprehensive consumer privacy bills, for example, and what states are trying to do what, and that looks at that spectrum of the topic. We also have a different section here within this last part here, which is the AI regulation to prevent general harms. If you have been following me and you have seen some of my monthly news, you would have seen that the European AI Act also touches on the general harms of AI and how to categorize and utilize different metrics or different systems to apply and mitigate potential issues for AI based on the kind of information that they are dealing with. This goes in the same line of thinking, if you will. Then they get into regulation for AI in employment settings, particularly interesting when we're thinking of public sectors. So we can try and start to understand how the US is actually thinking about utilizing AI from an employment setting perspective. AI in healthcare is a very important industry that we all should be aware of because we're all customers of healthcare naturally. So knowing how healthcare organizations should be dealing with AI is particularly interesting for all of us. AI in insurance and how AI can be used by government, right, based on state laws as well. They also talk about how to regulate generative AI based on state laws as well, and what states are doing what for Gen AI, and so on and so forth, right? So that's a particularly very interesting article that I found that I think you should be aware of, especially if you're dealing with public sector organizations, if you are a public sector organization dealing with AI security, or if you are engaging in conversations about utilizing AI in a public sector setting. Next up, I want to bring our attention to a report that Google released. This report is from Google's Red Team, and how their Red Team, or findings that the Red Team have come up with based on their interactions with AI systems and AI models, essentially. It's a great report because they summarize common types of attacks that red teams can use on AI systems, right? So when we're trying to categorize and create a taxonomy or create a lexicon of how what kind of attacks there are against AI systems, having a report like this helps cement the ideas of what we're trying to talk about, right? So prompt attacks, training data extraction, backdooring the model, and so on and so forth. So these are TTPs, attacker tactics, techniques, and procedures that are used some shape, way, or form with AI. Now, this report, as you can see, it's a 20 page long report, and it details every single step of each of these TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures. And I would highly recommend you read this thoroughly. But there's also the summary page for it. So this other page here is the summary of how Google is, what Google's reporting, what Google's AI Red Team is actually reporting. So just summarizing what the whole report is all about. And what I really like about this page here is the summarization of all these different, or 6 TTPs that the Red Team highlights against AI models. So when we look at them, we're looking at prompt attacks, we're looking at training, data extraction, backdooring the model, adversarial examples, data poisoning, and exfiltration. Many of these examples I have covered in attacks for the past few months, right? So we have seen many of these attacks be leveraged and used on the field, actually, right? So they're not, for the most part, they're not talking about anything new, but they are coming up with a way to present it that is particularly interesting for cybersecurity architects and people who need to organize their thoughts about this kind of topic. So I will leave this here for your perusal. Next up is another Google report. This was released early August. It's called the Threat Horizons. It's their own report based on findings that their cloud incident response teams have found recently. Now, what they're going to talk about in this report, and you can see here again, 20-odd page long report. They're going to talk about what are the most prominent attacks seen and reported against their GCP customers. So it's quite an important segment and part of the industry, the cloud industry, that we should be aware of. I have 2 graphics in here and a third comment that I really want to bring our attention to. This first graphic here is particularly interesting. Cloud compromise factors found in Q1 2023. As you can see here, the majority, more than half of it, is related to credential issues. So these are weak or no password related access and compromise to cloud environments. So it's a glaring number here and something that we should all be paying attention when we're managing cloud environments, but also when we're protecting it, ensuring that proper credential control is put in place. Secondly, you'll see 19% here is coming from misconfiguration. Again, one of the biggest issues with cloud environments and cloud security, misconfiguration. Not necessarily anything new, but presented in a great way here for us to have further insight into it. The next graphic I want to bring your attention to is the Google's Chronicle signals for essentially top risk actions that lead to compromise. So they highlighted here tactics, techniques, and procedures that their incident response teams have found to be more utilized and risky, actually, in cloud environments. You can see that almost 3/4 of it is stemming from one kind of action, which is what they call and they dub cross-project abuse of GCP access token generation permission. It's a very long name, but what I love about it is that the report here, they actually they put it in industry format, what this technique actually means. For any cybersecurity responder and engineer, we are all familiar with MITRE ATT&CK. So when we think of this kind of top risky action in MITRE ATT&CK framework form factor, well, they actually listed out to us. So the most common MITRE ATT&CK techniques that their team has found in terms of riskiness or risky is these 2 here. privilege escalation, TA004, and technique of valid accounts for cloud accounts, right? So T1078.004. So watch out for these kind of techniques as well. If you're implementing a detection mechanism where you're based on MITRE attack framework, watch out for this particular two techniques and tactics there. Now, the report is very thorough. It contains a whole range of information that touches on a lot more things that are very important from a cloud perspective. But what I want to bring your attention to is this last section here, which touches on supply chain threats. Supply chain issues and supply chain concerns, especially when we talk about software and technology, is nothing new, right? It has been on the news, and in some way, shape, or form, we have seen attacks leveraging supply chain compromises. What's great about this section of the report is this image, which summarizes 8 areas in which supply chain can be exploited, essentially. So be aware of the source threats related to supply chain. Great image here for you as a cybersecurity architect and a CISO. So watch out for these points of stress, if you will, right? So to potentially your supply chain. They listed out here the source threats as well. So there could be submitting unauthorized changes, there could be compromised source repo, there could be the build for a modified source, and so on and so forth. Great view into it. And they also share their own doing or their own creation of a graphic that represents software dependencies and where supply chain could come from, which could either be from direct dependencies, as you can see here on this left-hand side image, or from indirect dependencies on the right-hand side here. These are very common, especially when we think of something that happened like Log4j. A lot of software, pieces of software, had indirect dependencies with that package, and so it generated a lot of issues for the industry because of that supply chain compromise. So great ways to look at this kind of threat landscape there for us. So great report overall as well. Be mindful of it. You can find the link to all of these in, of course, my report, and it's all on the web anyway. It's all public information. Next, Microsoft released a cyber threats signals. That's the number 5 issue of this report. And in this report, they take a look at attacks happening against a large-scale sports event, which was the FIFA World Cup in Qatar. So that's a great look into what kind of threat actors and what kind of threats could be going into these large-scale worldwide sports events as well. So Microsoft here states what they've done and where these reports stem from, but essentially they perform the security for the event, and the learnings are shared in this report right here. What is really great about it, it's that they report sports-related cyber attacks. So if you work with in a sports industry, this could be relevant information for you to take to your board, for you to take to your engineers and to your architects in order to raise awareness about what the cybersecurity landscape looks like for that particular industry. Great insights. And then, of course, as they always do in the reports, they provide some mitigation options and mitigation recommendations at the bottom of the report, right? So you can look at cyber risks that are related to large events and venues, how you can protect yourselves in large venues like that. But then there's also the security snapshots in here from the report itself. As you can see, this report monitored entities and events 24/7 between November 10th and December 20th, 2022. And this includes organizations that are directly involved in or affiliated with tournament infrastructure, right? So activity includes human-led proactive threat hunts to identify emerging threats and track notable campaigns. And they list out some numbers here of how many endpoints they protected throughout this timeline in this exercise here, or in this particular point in time for this particular report. So great look into what protecting a large-scale sports event looks like and what kind of threats could stem from it. Next, I want to talk about Cloud Security Alliance, CSA, and an article that they released about generative AI and a proposed shared responsibility model, which we should all be familiar with in some ways, with the cloud shared responsibility model, which is something very well understood in the cloud industry, right? So as cloud providers, cloud adopters, and cloud consumers and users, we have to understand the responsibilities of me as a user and also the provider, and where their shared responsibility lies in terms of owning the infrastructure, maintaining the infrastructure, maintaining the software, and so on and so forth. What is proposed by this article from CSA is a similar approach to generative AI. So they go on to explain the different layers and different fields within artificial intelligence, which is a very summarized way of looking at it. But what really is important here from my perspective is this graphic right here, the proposed shared responsibility model for generative AI. It's really looking at generative AI coming from an infrastructure as a service perspective, platform as a service, or as a SaaS. Now, we ourselves, surely you have used a SaaS-based generative AI yourself, such as Bing Chat, or of course ChatGPT, or even Google's Bard, and so on and so forth. So these are SaaS. They're provided by a third-party service provider. And then when we look at different lines and responsibilities from an access control, who lies and where does the responsibility lie in terms of the provider or the service user, right? Great example here. But then when we think of large organizations looking to have full control over their data and their customers' data, we have to start thinking about what is our responsibility as an IaaS, right? As an infrastructure as service, where we are providing potentially the infrastructure, but then we are bringing in and we're taking the model back to this provider, and we are of course training and tuning our own models, for example, to deal with the data however we want it to. And so thinking about the shared responsibility model from that perspective is quite helpful to explain where does these public generative AI chat services lie, the responsibility lie, and where our responsibilities as users should lie as well in terms of security and controlling data, for example. So great little model there for reference. Okay, so hopefully you found this month's news interesting, much like what I did. Now, there have been a lot of pieces of news that I didn't bring along because they either didn't come through me or because really there wasn't enough time. So hopefully you found this informative and useful for you. If you did, drop a like, leave a subscribe, and let me know in the comments what you found useful or not, and what do you think about AI regulation in the future, because that's still top of my mind, and I'll keep an eye out for that. Thank you, and till next time.